Alright, welcome to week 2 of this course, The Science of Complementary and Integrative Medicine. Today we will continue our conversation on the most important figures of medicine and medical history, and we're also going to go a little beyond the theory. We will see how does that translate to practice. And the first couple of slides have to do with this question. Was Leonardo da Vinci an anatomist or a natural philosopher? And I'll encourage you to take a look at this slide, click on the link, and watch a little presentation, and it will come back here. Now, if you watch the video by Francis Wells, then you will have a broader understanding, hopefully, of what it means to examine certain medical data. Now, of course, the main focus here is the human heart, but I would like to take you a little back in history here and see if we can make still the claim that observation is still so important in the field of medicine and also predicts the way science has developed in the last 2,000 years at least. Now, we see a few slides here. In the first one, you see the description of human pulmonary circulation in the Nippur ruins, which are in modern-day Iraq, 4,000 years old about. And on the right side, the Ibn Nafis manuscript in Damascus. Now, this is one of the most accurate documents in human history. And it was described in Sumerian cuneiform tablet. Now, within Sumer, within the Fertile Crescent, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, there was a never-ending series of scientific endeavors, discoveries, sharing of knowledge at the intersection of multiple cultures. And this is kind of going back to what we said in the previous lecture, the fact that nowadays, yes, we do have the internet, we have computers, we have the ability to communicate very, very fast and effectively, with the exception of social media, I shall say. But this has been true, this ability to share knowledge and verify claims and be and develop this sense of awe in front of the variety of knowledge that multiple cultures brought together that make the history of medicine so important for our current understanding of what it means to practice this field. The next figure in the slide is Wim Hof from Folkestone, England. We're talking about the latest part of the Renaissance. We're already moving on to the Baroque and Rococo period. We're talking about the 1600s here. So who was Harvey? We could spend hours and hours talking about him, but I want to include him in this class because he was really the first anatomist and physician, just to continue with our question, to clearly describe, again, what we saw in the previous image, the pulmonary circulation. And he did that in a way to rationalize knowledge. Now, he didn't just observe it, he calculated, he counted, all right? He analyzed the capacity of the heart, and he analyzed it by timing it and counting on how many times the heart was able to beat within half an hour, within 30 minutes. And so this is another important factor here. It's not just about the ability to detect a specific phenomenon. It's how we translate that in a viable form, in a way that will allow our research to be applicable outside of the lab. So, from observation to calculation, from empirical evidence perceived with our senses to statistical or biostatistical analysis, all the way to epidemiology. The next person, we're going back in time, and I'll tell you why. It's Galen, a name that you should remember from the previous lecture. He was a Greco-Roman physician, philosopher. Again, ethnic Greek, working in the Roman Empire. We could spend a lot of time talking about that aspect. And he believed that blood passed between the ventricle by means of invisible pores. Okay? So the system was porous in itself. So according to him, the venous system was quite separate from the arterial system. Now, this view was shared by Harvey as well. And so it's interesting to see the time passing between the two scientists, okay? A lot of changes, but certain things were still held to be true from the perspective of authority. Now, this is something that started to change already in the 1600s, okay? But it became extremely important in the Age of Enlightenment. A lot of science relied on authority as in fame, as in respect toward the name. Okay, so for instance, for things that we could not back then observe directly, we would rely to the most authoritative figure in the field. We would believe that. Okay, now we still do the same to this day, and there's nothing wrong with it. So for instance, my field again is psychology, neuroscience, psychiatry. I'm definitely not an expert in cardiothoracic surgery. So if I'm about to read a peer-reviewed paper, I think I have enough knowledge to understand the research, but to know what is out there in terms of meta-analysis and to see if there's anything else that I should know, I had to rely to my colleagues at the hospital that practice cardiothoracic surgery. There's no way that anybody can be an expert in every field. And so I rely on their scientific ability to tell me what things I should know at this point, because I don't have the capacity, the ability, the time to dedicate to all these fields. So it was something similar at the time as well. Until someone comes with a better observation that shakes to the ground the previous assumption. In this case, we're talking about Malpighi, and that's what we're going to see next in the next slide. So we talked about him already in the previous slideshow. Now he was the first, again, biologist, physician, philosopher, to see capillaries in animals and to discover the link between arteries and veins. He also described the human brain as a gland, which is a correct statement if you think about modern neuroscience and endocrinology. If you think about the connection between the endocrine system and the nervous system, between neurotransmitters and hormones, okay, and the role of the limbic system and the role of the hypothalamus and so on. So descriptions that were becoming better, more accurate. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, let's take a broader look here. Galen was also an author, and he wrote that the best physician is also a philosopher. All right? And I wrote here, he followed Hippocrates in warning medicine against a certain type of philosophy, namely some of the considerations of the Pythagoreans and more generally the pre-Socratics. His model of direct observation constituted an in medio standpoint between rationalism and empiricism. Modern medicine, in comparison to traditional medicine, has been permeated by a strong distinction between matter and mind. Now, let's stop here for a second. For the correct definition of pre-Socratic philosophy, again, I'll recommend going back to the textbook and read about that. But generally speaking, Malpighi was interested in a philosophy that was rationally based. That, from our perspective, seems to be a given. Rationally based as opposed to still permeated, by certain esoteric, spiritual, transcendental elements. Something that we will encounter again when we talk about Descartes' thesis. But more than that, he found an in medio standpoint, something in between rationalism and empiricism, which appears to be counterintuitive at first. We want our science to be empirical and rational. We sometimes confuse those terms in modern times. And I want to specify that from his perspective, empiricism meant direct observation. So before you make a claim, you need to match your claim to what you actually can see. So if your senses are contrary to your statements, then you have to revise your theory, in other words. Okay? But it has also to be rational. Again, rational from the perspective of ratio. Okay? So again, going back to the biostatistical analysis, it has to make sense, and also has to make sense in the vast majority of cases. Statistically speaking, you have to find an average. in a standardized patient. Okay? Now the distinction between matter and mind, as we will see, has to do with one of the assumptions in modern medicine. Again, Malpighi said that the body was a machine, or the body is a machine, and Descartes, the French philosopher, again, toward the end of the 1600, stated something like "Cogito ergo sum," or "I think therefore I am." We will not spend too much time on Descartes, but I want to at least think about the profound value that his statement had to our science to this day. There's mind, there's body, there's matter, there is a connection between the two, yes, no. Now, one of the issues with the Descartes view was that there was a separation between mind and body. Now, from the perspective of medicine psychology, body is somewhat equivalent with brain. Brain as the seat of our psychological mechanism, the seat of our nociceptive faculty or pain receptors as well. To the point that we could make the claim that pain in itself does not exist but in the brain. And see how important that statement is when we'll talk about acupuncture, from the perspective of certain medical practices, traditional medicines, and, for example, fibromyalgia, when we will analyze specific medical issues, disorders, illnesses, and so forth. Now, Descartes viewed the pineal gland as the seat of the soul, the principal seat of the soul, and therefore cognition. Now, is soul and cognition the same? Well, traditionally there was a way to define our brain as, for instance, our prefrontal cortex as the new man of the spirit, as opposed to the limbic system, the old man of the flesh. Now, of course, man as in human beings, Old English, Germanic language, and spirit as cognition. So the idea was that there were higher cognitive faculties that could be equivalent to a spiritual sense, not necessarily in a transcendental religious sense. And I mention this because Descartes is to be considered one of the first materialists by some, although he was a Catholic priest. And he made a big mistake of separating two entities that, after that point in time, he wasn't the first one to do that, but one of the most important figures that popularized the term of separation between mind and body, and that think therefore I am. And the reason was that the more we knew about the way we were built, the less need we had for any type of spiritual, soul-like, and to some extent psychological type of analysis. This is kind of what happens in the decision between hard sciences and soft sciences, or between natural empirical sciences and social sciences. It's a very common misunderstanding, as if social sciences are on a different level than natural science. Natural science study what is true work. It's matter-based. Okay? Now, the separation between mind and body was a great effort to get rid of some elements in the past that define matter and mind as a unicum in which certain soul, spiritual-like influences will have an ultimate control of our body. And of course it had to do with the tradition of religion in Europe and elsewhere. So Descartes attempted to separate those things so that science could do its job better. It was a matter of separation of magisteria. If you're in the lab, you should leave your religion aside and focus only on what you see. You cannot rely on any philosophy or spirituality in the lab. You have to be very, very scientific. If by scientific, once again, we think about rational and empirical. So the idea was a good one. It was the idea upon which the Age of Enlightenment built its science. And of course, to this day, we cannot make the claim to know where the soul is located in the brain, if this question makes sense at all, given that by soul we could identify emotional processes, cognitive processes, and a variety of other neural underpinnings. But thinking of the pineal gland was quite interesting for the time in which this hypothesis was developed. Now, if there are things that we can understand by observation, there are things that we have to monitor based on previous knowledge. Think about the distinction between mind and body, a distinction that we will examine more and more as we progress in this semester, okay, and what type of separation we have, whether a person is fully dualist, or dual, two things, Greek, Latin, mind and body separate, or whether a person is a monist, one thing dominates, and whether this person might or might not be an idealist, or whether the attitude is mind over matter, matter over mind, or there is a third element. We'll see about that. But is there anything there that could be understood as observation is the key? Okay, we talk about rationalism and we talk about empiricism. So can we rely on our senses? Now the next slide talks about the doctrine of signature. And the doctrine of signature, from the memory of Pedanius stated that for certain things happening to our body, there were certain ailments that we could use for the benefit of the amelioration of this process. So in other words, plants and vegetables, especially, and fruits, if they looked similar to the organ, to the area of our body we want to treat, that was an indication that they have properties that were beneficial for that particular organ. So you have a slide of several examples here. Now this is a modern slide that takes the doctrine of signatures, so the physical signatures of an entity that is representing our bodies, and applies to the modern world. Now, of course, Descartes could not have possibly created this table here just because we have the presence of plants that were not present at the time. Think about the tomatoes, for instance. But as you can see here, there is a similarity between the shape of the plant, the shape of the fruit, and the shape of the organ. Now, is this scientifically based? We will see what it means in modern time. Now, in a lot of situations here, a lot of examples, the answer is a cognitive summary. And by that I mean, these tables are a representation of a way to memorize certain foods, for instance, that are beneficial for certain organs, not because of the properties, and that is a cognitive mistake, a theoretical, epistemological mistake on the part of Descartes to claim that the shape is determining the effect, or better stated, that there is a higher principle that creates the shape of the organ and of the plant. But the properties might be nevertheless useful. We will see. Now, talking about perception, talking about things we perceive with our senses. After all, seeing those plants, those flowers, those fruits, means using our senses, means using, in specific, our occipital lobe, our visual cortex, and of course, interpreting the data. Does that apply to observing fellow human beings as well? One of the questions that many philosophers dealt with in attempting to understand what it means to be human. And this is important from the patient-provider relationship. So I have a quote by Maurice Merleau-Ponty from the Phenomenology of Perception. If we're talking about a patient as part of his history or time and material space, material in the sense of the here and now, a geographical space, a contextual space, we understand from Merleau-Ponty's work how the body subject is also body object. This is an important factor here. The assumption that, following Malpighi, the body is a machine, and then following Descartes, between mind and body, the machine is the body, implies that whatever object we're talking about, this is a separate entity that is observable and it's its own thing. So for instance, if we observe in the field of natural science the movement of a tectonic plate, for instance, okay, or just the movement of a stone, the porous structure and surface of a stone, of a rock, our sheer act of observation is not expected to make any change whatsoever to that item, to that object. In other words, since the rock is not animate, an inanimate object, the fact that we are there does not change the result. So we can analyze the stone because we know that our action of analyzing will not determine any change in our observation. But can that be said about human beings as well? That is a question that is postulated by Merleau-Ponty, by Levinas, and many others. Probably one of the most important cases of the application of this statement is Schrödinger's cat. Now, the body subject is also a body object. This has to do with patient-centered medicine, so the understanding that our presence, physical and cognitive, will alter the results of our interaction, since we are doing medicine to help patients. And also we'll tell them more about ourselves. And that's the definition of the other, this otherness, the person that you distinct from me in the philosophy by Levinas. Not just that, but our perception is not just a matter of philosophical speculation. It's a matter, not because philosophical speculation is not important, but it's also a matter of observable changes at the level of the body. And this is one of the areas in which embodied cognition plays a major role. I'm going to quote a work by Foglia and Wilson. Traditional views in philosophy of mind and cognitive science depict the mind as an information processor, one whose connection with the body and the world are of little theoretical importance. On the contrary, mounting empirical evidence shows that bodily states a modality-specific system for perception and action underlie information processing, and the embodiment contributes to various aspects and effects of mental phenomena. By challenging mainstream accounts of mind and cognition, embodiment views offer new ways of conceptualizing knowledge and suggest novel perspective of cognitive variation in mind-body reductionism. The important thing here is not to say that the body is not important, quite the contrary. Not to say that the mind is not important, quite the contrary. The important thing is the link. The body is no longer a container of psychological factors. Okay? The body is its own psychological factor. Okay? The body, in other words, has its own intelligence, its own way of being, its own emotional responsiveness. And in turn, the body has an influence of psychological processes. To the point that some might ask, so what's the point of separating those two? Okay? Should we go back to a monist understanding? And only after that we'll decide whether it's important to discard everything about psychological processes, mind, and possible soul. In other words, there is no such thing as a soul, there's no such thing as a self that exists in our body. The body is me. Or the opposite, that the body is intelligence insofar as a soul animates it. So as the ultimate ingredient. This is a comparative analysis that it's very hard to do in the context of 15 weeks class on traditional, complementary, alternative medicine. And so if you need to have more information about specific philosophical approaches, feel free to email me. I included just a few slides in this course. Particularly in this week, I created a little overview on the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, which again, it's somewhat of an approximation and a superficial understanding what it means. Generally speaking, especially in the Western world, in the Anglo-Saxon world, and definitely in the United States, analytic philosophy is philosophy, in the sense that it's the one that's taught the most. And continental philosophy, it's this at times foreign perceived philosophy that's practiced in the dark castles and alleys in Europe. Continental comes from the continent, continental Europe, as opposed to the UK. And a little by definition contains an analysis, so it has to do with logic and science. And continental philosophy is very often attacked because of this subjective, non-scientific, ascientific, at times anti-scientific, postmodernist attitude. It's also a philosophy that contains intuition, the capacity and ability to wonder about reality. It has to do with history and literature and being human, the human condition. Again, existence over essence, essence over existence. We talk about existentialist philosophy or not. In any case, it's a different way to be in the world, and it's something that it's not just related to philosophy. You can think about the social, cultural, historical, ethnic even context that separate East and West less artificially than we would like to believe. For instance, I'm thinking about the separation between East and West as a clash of civilization that unfortunately certain politicians use as a tool to compare, contrast, and destroy the other. Again, this otherness, maybe us, when we're thinking about exporting a certain self-perceived democratic process. For instance, in the Middle East, in which you have the modern rendering of the Christian crusaders against the Muslim invaders, or the other way around. Well, the truth is much more complex than that. And if you just think about the Great Schism in this context, permitting this brief excursion there, opening this parenthesis, where philosophy in the traditional Orthodox Christianity in the East, as opposed to the one practice, the same practice in the Western Catholic world, after the Schism, of course, has to do with this human condition element, okay? Not only the Eastern counterpart was less scientific than the Western counterpart, but they refused to be scientific the same way as the West was, because they considered it to be a betrayal of what the ultimate truth is. So in other words, truth, it's not to be speculated and analyzed, speculated upon and analyzed through the device of reason. It has to be understood. And understanding, it's a much more profound, much deeper process that, in this context, Western science would like us to believe. Now, does that apply to medicine as well? After all, we should think of medicine as equally valid East, West, North, and South. Otherwise, it will not be medicine. It's one of our core tenets in our scientific endeavor. For something to be true, it has to be universally true. Okay? The rest is opinion. Again, the rest is doxa. The rest is system of belief. But science has to be universally valid. The other slide here is naturalism, and you see other elements here: philosophy of abstraction, epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and the rejection of certain elements. I'd like you to read this slide on your own, because we will talk more about that in the next lecture. The following image is a comparative analysis between dualism and monism. Again, a very, very brief description. On one side, you have duality, dualism, based on the teaching by Descartes. So P or PH for physis, for physical, and M for mentis, mind, mental substance. So there's a separation. And on the other side, you have a monistic, monos or unus, okay, so just one. Physicalist, in which matter controls the mind, so matter is the mind even. Idealism, the other way around, where mind controls matter. And neutral monism with a third substance, a transcendental substance, maybe even a divine substance, a godlike substance. Right? Now, since we talked about this mind-body connection and separation, how can we define health? Now, let's let's think about health as the combination of multiple factors. Okay? Health as the completion, and yet not necessarily perfection. Perfection means ultimate end-like completion. There's nothing else, which will be synonymous with death, biological death. But health as involving all aspects of biopsychosocial approach. All right? And since health is connected etymologically, historically, to being healthy, holy, wealthy, whole, complete, okay? Where there was a union of elements, so a person could be fully integrated, united, not separated, not disintegrated, not dissociated, and all elements function as in an orchestra, in unison. That's, well, we use organism as a term after all. From this perspective, few things to keep in mind. So since health involves all the above, the biopsychosocial model, so physical, psychological, social well-being, everything is health, and therefore medicine has to address all these realms. Explanation is treatment, treatment is cure. Hippocrates described with proposing the first rational explanation of why people get sick. Now, this might sound very common sense to this day, but in fact there was a reason and is reasoning, again, in rationality, a motivation, a cause, a chain of effect and cause and effect, as to why people get sick. It's quite remarkable. Okay? Not why as in it's divine will or it's the nature of things, but it's what process, what mechanism, because those things are not equivalent, they're not the same. And that's what we mean by etiology, symptomatology, diagnosis, and prognosis. There are different ways to interpret a certain problem. Now, these different ways are very, very different approaches, even different parts of the same discipline. If you think about traditional Chinese medicine, as we will see, or traditional Tibetan medicine, when we talk about the tantras, okay? Very different analysis, very different intent, very different theoretical background, okay? Same philosophical component, same culture, same history, but very distinct process, very distinct areas of intervention. Other important point, the germ theory of disease. Now, this is something that's extremely important because we have to think about the possible danger in over positivistic, over empirical approach to science. Now, for the most part, having a positivistic, materialistic, empirical attitude towards science, it's good. Okay? For the most part, what we do in Western evidence-based medicine is good. The fact that whatever we're doing, a surgery has to be performed the exact same way, regardless of the system of belief of the individual performing the surgery. This is a good thing, okay? With some minor exception from the perspective of bioethics, but in terms of the technique itself, it's a good thing. The separation between matter and mind, or even more, matter and soul, system of belief. Okay? And yet, one of the issues with positivistic approach was this scientistic approach, which turned out to be more of a cult rather than a subjective, verifiable endeavor. So this positivistic approach, just like parts of European Enlightenment and American Enlightenment as well, wanted to state that what is a fact has to be observable, and what is real is what we see. In fact, everything that's real is what we see, and what we cannot see, it's not real. Right? So a traumatic event affecting the epidermis is real, so we can see it. A internal hemorrhage is real because we can see it. melancholic humor is not real unless we can link it to a body process. Now, to claim at that time, okay, that germs cause disease from the perspective of positivistic science was a complete nonsense. It was a nonsense that was predicted upon the lack of technology at the time, okay? Technology is in techne, one of the parts of Aristotle's knowledge. And it was a nonsense because since science could not observe germs therefore did not exist and therefore could not cause any harm, therefore could not cause disease. Now, while this seems to be pretty, naive at first and even not potentially dangerous, think about the implication to sanitizing properties in healthcare, things as simple as washing one's hands prior to surgery. And of course, the germ theory of disease was born as a theory until we had the necessary knowledge in the context of technology, microscopes, to say that the theory was right. So again, theory had to be scientific in a sense that they follow everything we said last week. They have to be consistent, they have to be verifiable, but they also have to venture. They have to add something. Okay? They try to present reality in a different way. What else would cause disease? Well, think about psychology. In this slide, I only mentioned Freud and Franz Alexander. Disease could be caused by psychological conflicts. Now, this is a big part of complementary alternative medicine because there is a combination between different layers of reality, some of which we can see and some of which are completely hidden from sight. And those are usually the territory of psychology. If we want to avoid thinking about philosophy and theology, spirituality, they're definitely the field of psychology. And so the approach of the germ theory of disease is, again, utilizing this context. Just because you cannot see something, you cannot make the assumption that something does not exist. The usual sentence goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Right? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the other way around, of course. Okay? So, evidence of absence. You have the proof that something does not exist. Absence of evidence, you don't have enough proof. Alright? So by the other words, we mean that those things are not synonymous. Alright? So you can have a situation where you don't see something, you cannot make the claim that just because you don't see it, this thing does not exist. Okay? And of course, we use see in a figurative way, because see, after all, is one of our senses. And yet, we cannot make a claim that everything we perceive our senses is true. Quite the contrary, at this point, we know how easily fooled we are as human beings. From the accounting perspective, we already know that computers and all sorts of technologies, it's much faster and more accurate than us. It's not the same. We don't want to confuse computational neuroscience and computational analysis of cognition with different layers of interpretation of reality. But in terms of speed of computational ability, a computer is much better than us. But at the same time, there are multiple spheres of interaction. For instance, if you just think about psychoanalysis, and I have a few slides here as well, the difference between the superego, the ego, and the id, and our pleasure and cravings, and transfer and counter-transfer mechanism, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious elements are not just different in quantities, they are different in qualities as well. Now, we don't have to embrace Freudian psychoanalysis at all. In fact, I advise people not to, but at least consider that as one of the reactionary link to this positivistic science, coming from a place in which positivistic approach was to be considered the ultimate truth. We cannot say that Freud was anti-positivism. We cannot say that psychoanalysis was born as a way to bring back esoteric, spiritual, even religious issue. Quite the contrary, Freud had a big, diatribe with Jung, for instance, and with Rank and many others in this regard. His approach was trying to figure out something in our bodies that would account for a empirical presence of something that could be otherwise be perceived only in the realms of mind processes. Now, we will talk more about that, but for now I just want to stress how important it is to understand why our philosophical understanding really plays such a major role in the way we practice medicine, the way we think about the healing process, for instance, right? All right, I'll stop here for a second with Freudian psychoanalysis, because we're going to re-examine that when we'll talk about specific branches and tradition of complementary medicine. Some history here. I share with you a map, the latest part of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Constantinople, and the Persian Empire, okay, the Sassanid dynasty. Now, the thing I want people to be aware of is how much shared information there was at the time, all right? And in this context, think about that. I want to reintroduce some of the historical figures that we briefly encountered last week, starting from Moshe or Moses ben Maimon. Okay, early Middle Ages, we would think, from the European perspective, three things I would like you to remember about him. Author of multiple studies, but I want you to remember The Art of the Cure, or Art of Cure, extracts from Galen, the commentary of the Aphorisms of Hippocrates, and Medical Aphorism of Moses. What we said in the previous class was the importance of testing the validity of certain claims and retesting and doing the same studies again and again to verify whether results can and will be repeated. The same thing with passing knowledge. A lot of the works by these ancient figures, phenomenal figures, was to reassess, reinterpret, and even translate the knowledge of the ancient ones to allow us to interact with these figures. The next one, again, Ibrahim Avicenna. His psychology requires the connection between the body and soul be strong enough to ensure the soul's individuation, but weak enough to allow for its immortality. Now, this is extremely important when we think about the mystical, philosophical, religious, ethnic, cultural understanding of the reasons behind certain dietary tradition and restrictions. Okay? The connection between the body and soul be strong enough to ensure the soul individuation. So in other words, the soul has to be fully embodied to function. The soul needs a body to be in this world, to interact, to live. But the body needs a soul to survive. So elements, types of food we eat that will allow for a better rooting mechanism in our body. So you feel rooted, you feel connected to your body, are the ones that will make your soul feel its body and will make the body feel itself more. On the contrary, weakened process will allow the soul to be immortal. Now, this connection and separation between soul and body, it's not specific only to Islam. In fact, we could argue that one tradition within Judaism first, Christianity afterwards, and finally with Islam is this combination between mind and body. When we think about the union, as in resurrection, for instance, between mind and body, this tradition appear to be much more, they have to have a view in which mind and body are much more connected than, for instance, in the tradition in the Indian subcontinent, where in the Buddhist tradition and Taoistic tradition, Hindu tradition, and so on and so forth, where mind and body are completely separated. So the body it's this shell that we will leave behind, and eventually the soul will continue its journey. This is true for reincarnation. It's true for the most ancient culture before the conversion to Judaism, Christianity, Islam. So we're talking about ancient culture in Canaan, in Mesopotamia, and in Rome, in Greece, in Europe. So there are some of the things that filter through, and we can think of certain food, for instance, food that will make the body feel more alive, and we think about sugars and carbs and stimulants that will make the body feel more alive, that is awake, aware. Think about coffee, for instance. It was primarily utilized also to stay awake and pray overnight. Okay? And think about foods such as chamomile, for instance. They can be used either topically as a cream or as, distilled in the form of a tea, of a herbal infusion that allow the body to feel itself less and less. These proprioceptive mechanisms allow the body to fade away, so to speak. So you can either live during nighttime and dream and fall asleep, or have this eternal sleep, which is the same as physical death, but is connected to immortality because the soul will endure. All right, so think about that as a philosophical component. The next slide is a combination of multiple authors and important figures in the Persian tradition. For clarity, I divided in three periods: the Iranian-Afghani medicine, the Pahlavi literature, and finally the Achaemenid dynasty. So Darius, first of Persia, this is just to indicate part of the enormous knowledge that was filtered through these two powerhouses in the ancient world, so the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, and what type of medicine this author focused on. All right, so all between the 9th and 10th centuries AD. We will review this as well. So for now, we just focus mostly on Europe, the Middle East, part of Africa, part of Asia, but especially Southern Europe and the Middle East. Now, jumping ahead a little bit here, in Europe, since we always talk about the founding fathers of medicine, Hildegard von Bingen is definitely the founding mother of modern medicine, at least from traditional German medicine. I also want to stress that I use the term traditional German medicine somewhat loosely here, broadly. It is not a translation of traditional German medicine of the term traditionelle deutsche Heilkunde that has a very specific 20th century, in fact, origin with some very controversial socio-political and philosophical component. We will talk more about that. We're talking about German medicine as part of the traditional European medical background, so TEM, traditional European medicine. She was also a philosopher, of course, a religious figure, an abbess from the Benedictine order, a polymath, a philosopher, and a composer, a very important figure. The next one, Samuel Hahnemann, is the founding father. His name is pretty much synonymous with homeopathy, a very specific branch of complementary and integrative medicine that we will examine in depth. Now, from the perspective of what homeopathy is, this notion that a smaller portion of the thing that will make us sick is in itself cure, it's not too different from the theoretical perspective from vaccination, for instance. Okay, so eliciting an immune response-like mechanism, this does not mean that a homeopathic vaccination is a vaccination. In other words, it's as scientifically valid as a quote-unquote real vaccination. And we're not saying that. We're just talking about the theoretical component is very, very similar. We will talk more about homeopathy Next week we're going to examine a video by Dr. Ernst, but for now thinking about Samuel Hahnemann as the founding father of homeopathy as a field of complementary medicine. In fact, homeopathy is still utilized in the Anglo-Saxon world as an opposite to allopathy, right? So Western-based Western evidence-based hospitals are usually considered to be allopathic hospitals. In other words, allo as in the opposite. You're doing something that goes against biology. And the example that comes to mind is an antibiotic goes against life, not life of the individual, but the life of the element of disruption and bacteria that you are trying to address with an antibiotic. This will be an allopathic mechanism. The homeopathic, as it implies, is trying to cure using this similar element that is cause the disease, right? Cause of the disease. So homeopathy as homeopathic medicine, allopathy as in allopathic medicine. Next figure, Rudolf Steiner, Austrian, Croatian, modern day Croatia, founding father of anthroposophic medicine and many other connected disciplines, biodynamic agriculture, anthroposophy, which it's very complex to discuss in this context, but had a lot of different branches, from the more spiritual, esoteric branch, era of the theosophic perspective of Maria Blavatsky, and the type of spiritualistic Central and Eastern European, Middle European, Austro-Hungarian, Ukrainian component of esoteric teaching, so in the field of theology and mysticism, as well in the field of pedagogical and educational component, thinking about the Waldorf schools, for instance. From our perspective, Rudolf Steiner is a fundamental figure in the context of anthroposophic medicine, which is it's both a complementary and alternative part of medicine, but it can also be a specialization in medicine in certain countries, for instance, in Austria, and to some extent in Italy and in Germany as well. In Germany, we have the figure of the Heilpraktiker or naturopathic practitioner that might utilize some elements of anthroposophic medicine as well. Other important traditions here, just a general overview, Russia and the Eastern Bloc, the former Soviet Union, as well as Southeastern Europe, the Narodnaya Medicina or Narodna Medicina in Bosnia and Serbia, Montenegro, and so on, so forth, Croatia. This idea of this millennia-old tradition that very often is transmitted from mother to daughter, from father to son. Very often it's the domain of the elderly women in the family, the babushka, that carry on this traditional popular knowledge. And by popular we mean popular in the etymological sense, the folk, the ethnicity, the populus, okay, so the narod or narod in Slavic languages, that are not just parallel to evidence-based medicine, but very often are the real medicine. There's a joke in Eastern Europe and Russia that what the West calls traditional medicine is real medicine, and Western medicine is by definition the alternative. Now things, of course, are different as a result of enhanced, I wouldn't say westernization, because it would be a paradox and an oxymoron in this context, but an empirified, logified, rationalized version of medicine during the time of the Soviet Union. So there's a renaissance of a more natural, traditional, mystical approaches since 1991, since the fall of the Soviet Union and of the communist system throughout Eastern Europe. The next slide is about Chinese and Tibetan medical tradition, so traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Tibetan medicine. And I just want to point out here that we're talking about a combination of multiple historical, cultural, and philosophical approaches. So there's Buddhism, there's Buddhist literature on one side, especially the Abhidharma and Vajrayana Tantras. as well as the Hindu, Indian medicine, Ayurveda, that you can find as a combination in these huge, both geographically and culturally relevant areas. Now, to conclude our conversation, I would like to briefly mention those four main elements within Tibetan medicine that we briefly discussed last week in connection with the four humors, okay? And this week as well in connection to the etiology, symptomatology, diagnosis, and prognosis. And those four elements are the Tantra. So the root Tantra, the exegetic Tantra, the instructional Tantra, and subsequent Tantra in Tibetan medicine. And I really encourage you to read through the information that you find in this slide to see what each of these Tantra represent in Tibetan medicine. Not just in terms of the historical differences, but what is the main goal of each of these Tantras, all right? Whether it's we talk about application, preparation, observation, and again, keep in mind that each part is a combination of the whole. The very last slide, it's a slide that will be just a brief introduction to American traditional medicine. Now, since we talk about tradition, we should always think about tradition from the perspective of a somewhat continuous ethno-cultural background. So American medicine, by definition, it's not the medicine we practice in our hospitals, or only to a very minor extent. It is tradition of America as Native America. And so not just the United States, of course, but the American continent, the Native American medical practices, shamanistic practices. And this is just an example on the ancient wheel of health, we could say, of the Anishinaabe tribe, and something that we will see over and over again, especially in connection to other geographical and cultural areas, especially Aboriginal medicine and traditional African medicine. For each of these traditions, we will dedicate at least an hour of our conversation, because they're very complex, they're fascinating, and what's even more interesting is that there's a lot of overlap between traditions that are geographically separate by miles and miles, and there seems to be a very, very interesting common core, both from the perspective of spirituality as well as precise medical practices, with some differences in recommendation and attitudes toward, for instance, dietary restrictions and modality of microsurgery, but overall there seems to be a universal common core. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I will see you next week.